Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of Into the Weeds, a podcast with Matt Kelly and Tom Fox. Matt Kelly is the former editor-in-chief of Compliance Week and now is the CEO of Radical Compliance. I am Tom Fox, the blogger at the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog and podcaster at the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Matt and I want to do podcasts where we really take deep dives into subjects, so that's why we've called this Into the Weeds. In episode 2, we're going to talk about continuous controls monitoring and the recent FCPA SEC enforcement action against Qualcomm. In both of these presentations, we really take a deep dive into both areas, so we hope that you will find these interesting. The episode comes in at just over 22 minutes. I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again in future episodes. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'm back with Matt Kelly for this episode of Into the Weeds with Tom Fox and Matt Kelly, or Matt Kelly and Tom Fox. So Matt, welcome back.
Tom, it's good to talk to you again. How are you?
Good. Matt, you recently wrote about or had a blog post on continuous controls monitoring, or CCM, and you wrote it around looks like a regional SCCE meeting that you attended.
Yeah.
So could you maybe start off by telling us about the meeting, and then what is CCM, at least in your mind?
Sure. The other month at the end of February, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics had their Boston one-day regional meeting, which I did go to, and it was great. And in fact, I would be remiss if I did not give a shout of praise out to Webb Hull. Webb is a local compliance aficionado up here in Boston, and he sort of chairs the local Boston meetings. So they had programmed a great session, a great day, and I thought one of the most interesting sessions really was about continuous controls monitoring. They had two guys from PwC speaking there, and they were just talking a bit about what continuous controls monitoring is, how it works. Their names were John Dalton and Jonathan McKenzie, so I should also give them some credit. But it was very informative, and CCM is an idea that I know compliance officers think about. They wonder a little bit about what it is. So that's where my idea to do just a quick refresher course on it came from. But that's it in a nutshell.
Matt, let me see. One of the things that I have struggled with internally is the following. Is CCM, or continuous controls monitoring, different than transaction monitoring? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it is. And in fact, I made a note of this in the post that I had on my blog, that financial professionals might have a very different first instinct about what monitoring is. They might think of it in terms of employee surveillance or looking for transactions, suspicious activity and whatnot. And, companies do have to monitor for that. But this is an instance where we're using that same word in two different senses. Continuous controls monitoring is more about once you have your control in place, you want to test it and you want to make sure that it is working. Now, over the long course of history, you might have an annual audit that tests your internal controls once a year, and then technology gets better. You're testing them once a quarter. Now you're in a very high pressure industry with a lot of technology. You might be testing your controls, every week or something. It's not, it is incorrect to say you're either doing continuous controls monitoring or you're not. This is not a hit the target or you miss entirely. It's more how quickly can we keep on cycling to look at the controls, test them, observe to see that if there are any other transactions that get by the control somehow, how do they get flagged and identified to you? As data analytics power gets better, we're going to be able to do this faster and faster. I don't know that there are many companies that do this on a true continuous nonstop basis, but there are plenty who are doing it more and more quickly. Eventually we'll get to continuous monitoring of your controls, and that's really what CCM is.
You've got a couple of phrases in here I wanted to ask you specifically about. The first is risk velocity.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, that I define it as the time that elapses between when you first realize you have a risk and when the risk blows up in your face. And
Succinctly put.
it is a fact of life that more and more risk velocity is getting, I guess you could say the velocity is getting faster, or the distance between understanding your risk and having it strike is getting shorter.
Right.
But I think a lot of that has to do with the rise of social media and reputation risk, that you can very, very quickly find yourself in a very bad situation. You might look at it through the lens of, say, data privacy, that 15 years ago, these cloud computing data storage services, they did not exist. It was very difficult to have a data privacy breach because your data is stored somewhere else. That was not easy to do. So the risk velocity there, you'd be able to think this is a risk, but it would take many, many months to open a new data storage center. So the velocity there was slow. That was then. This is now, when any employee with a credit card and an internet browser can, do something on Dropbox. It doesn't even cost any money on Dropbox a lot. You can put customer data up there at the drop of a hat. So the risk velocity there has, I struggle with, do we say it's collapsed to zero or it's increased to infinity? But, as soon as you see that risk, the risk is there. That's what risk velocity is, as I define it.
And unfortunately, that's true in a wide variety of risks. Third parties, anti-corruption, money laundering, emissions testing, safety, health, food, any of those.
Think of how long it would have taken a company in the 1980s to open a joint venture in China. It would have taken forever. Certainly the risks of corruption were still high back then. They were probably even higher. But the speed at which those risks of moving into China would strike your company were months, years. Now you could get yourself into trouble with Chinese bribery in a matter of days and potentially even hours, I could suspect.
You have a statement I wanted to ask you a little bit about. You say that compliance officers who want CCM to succeed at their companies have a delicate juggling act to do. What's that juggling act, and how would you suggest they, if not do it, think about it?
Well, this was a point that the two PwC speakers, Dalton and McKenzie, that I thought they hammered home that this is important, and I fully agree with them, that this is one of these occasions where compliance officers really have to be the conductor of the orchestra, because it is easy enough for other groups in your company to do control testing and monitoring themselves and not necessarily tell you. But the risk that Dalton and McKenzie were talking about is you might have business units off in the first line of defense. They're going to decide that they're testing controls themselves. Sounds like a great idea. We all talk about the first line of defense owning the control and the risk. But if they do this in a way that isn't meshing with what other business units are doing or what you want them to do, then they might use data that you can't mesh or normalize with other business units. They might test controls on a different cycle than you. They might test different things than you would prefer them to do. So you need to work with them. That's one part of the orchestra. At the same time, you also have in the third line of defense, you have internal audit, and internal audit is a powerful ally and very good friend of the compliance officer most times. But they might decide to do their own enterprise risk assessment of something else, and suddenly they're testing controls in a different area than what you think is the priority. Maybe you have the business unit and internal audit both doing these things at the same time. But there are risks of multiple data formats that you can't necessarily bring together into a good cohesive look at risk. There's perhaps different priorities. People might reach different conclusions. All of that doesn't help you, the compliance officer, to get a holistic view of risk. And even worse, potentially you might wind up telling different stories to your board, who will not appreciate having a sense that the company doesn't know what one hand is, the other hand is doing. So that's really where the diplomatic act and the balancing on the high wire and all sorts of metaphors, that's really where it comes into play.
Matt, I've heard you use the visual example of a piece of string that might be folded, bent, in curves and shapes. Um, and if you pull that string taut, you have a single line. Is the description you just gave of the CCO as the orchestra conductor consistent with that example, or were you talking about something different with the string example?
It's a slightly different. I often use the string example when talking about big data analytics, that you're analyzing different piles of data and almost like a piece of string zigzagging between a few different piles of data. And you tug on it, you can suddenly see right down the line to the conclusion that might otherwise not be apparent. I suppose that there's a similar risk afoot here if continuous controls monitoring is not well organized. You'll have different pockets monitoring different controls in different ways. You will have a great risk of not getting the information you, the compliance officer, want, or people telling themselves different stories and telling other people different stories. And it doesn't give a cohesive enterprise-wide sense of here are our priorities, here's what we're going to do, and then that should therefore lead to this final result of data that we can take and study in different ways. That's really what you want to get at, no matter any of my string analogies or any of the other metaphors I tend to use. But that's really what compliance officers want to get at.
You also talk about, in addition to the compliance officer being the conductor, some real obligations that the compliance officer has, and you pair that with perhaps internal auditors as well. Could you speak to those obligations?
Yeah, let's say you do get everybody lined up in the first line of defense and the third line of defense. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to and feeding this information into the compliance officer. The CCO has a responsibility and an obligation then to make sure that you give some of those insights back to the business. This is not a one-way street where you take all these conclusions and you just go to the board and you talk about compliance risks and everything's ending. You certainly want to have some sort of a feedback loop. Specifically, I would say to the first line, to the business units, so they know, number one, that everything you're asking them to do serves a purpose. And number two, that they can actually get some useful intelligence back from the compliance officer and suddenly, hey, I like working with compliance. Isn't this great? And fostering that stronger sense of cooperation between them. I would also say that another useful ally you should work with is the internal audit department. Don't forget what CCM really is designing tests to study your controls and figure out if they're effective. Designing tests to measure effectiveness is what internal auditors do. They are experts at this. You can certainly, pal around with them and work on these projects together, but they would be ideally suited to help you figure out what is the testing we actually want to do. So that's another part of this equation that compliance officers should remember.
You also speak about tying the results of your risk assessment to the controls you have. Could you speak to that, and also if the risk assessment shows that there are not controls in place, how you might think about filling that gap?
I thank you for bringing that up, because actually I was making some other notes on some other projects I'm working on. And if we really want to get into the weeds, and we always do with this podcast, the COSO framework from 2013 about internal control. The COSO framework has one specific principle called Principle 6.
Right.
That even says a company must set objectives clear enough so that you can assess the risk of trying to achieve those objectives. This is still something a lot of companies struggle with, just setting out what your objectives are. So I was kind of sketching out a logical sequence of what compliance officers and internal auditors and everybody else, what we should be doing to make sure this is all effective. I would say the life cycle of it is, do you first off have clear objectives for your compliance program? Can you then assess what the risks of non-compliance are? Can you create controls that address those risks? Can you then test those controls And can you then monitor them to see that your occasional tests are correct and you don't have any other transactions somehow sneaking in? That's what this whole life cycle of CCM looks like. But you really need to understand, what are my objectives I'm trying to achieve? What are the risks around them? And then, have I assigned a control to every risk? I suspect there are probably, in many large companies, there are controls out there that don't address any risk, and you can get rid of them. Or you might have duplicative controls, and you could get rid of one. That's what a lot of the SOX compliance in the mid-2000s was about. It was about removing your key controls and simplifying them as much as possible because you had too many. But you might have controls not assigned to any particular risk, which aren't assigned to any particular objective. If there's a risk out there, it needs to be addressed. If you have an objective out there, there are probably some risks to it. You need to be thinking, I guess, maybe in that triangle of what are your objectives, what are the risks, and then what are the controls for those risks.
And I was going to point to principles 16 and 17 under the COSO framework to take a look at it from the monitoring angle. So principle 16 says the organization selects, develops, and performs ongoing and/or separate evaluations to ascertain whether the components of the internal controls are present and functioning.
Mm-hmm.
Principle 17 says the organization evaluates and communicates internal control deficiencies timely to those parties responsible for taking corrective action, including senior management and the board of directors as appropriate. These were the two that really spoke to me about the need for the monitoring part of continuous control monitoring as an oversight of your continuous controls. Is that really the tying it back to the risk profile that you were thinking about?
I think so. I mean, certainly those principles are worth thinking through. And when you talk about, communicating weaknesses back to the responsible parties, that is a more formal statement, I guess, than what you and I were talking about a bit before, where you have to talk back to the business units after all of these tests to let them know how they're performing. They may have controls that are ineffective, but they're doing the best they can, and you don't necessarily know this. It may not be their fault, it may be the control's fault, or the control might be working, assuming your employees are paying attention to it, where it could be the business unit is doing something wrong. But you need to, that really is about being able to glean out proper information and then have conversations with the right parties to do something about that information if it says you have a weakness somewhere. So, principle 6 on setting objectives, which you can apply all over the place. And then principle 16 and 17 about building a feedback loop to get all of the results you have to put to some useful end. That's what principle 16 and 17 are, I would say.
That the feedback loop is really a great visual as well, because that's something that I think now most compliance practitioners are beginning to understand that is becoming not just a gold standard or even a best practice, but sort of a middle of the road now.
I think so. And I hear a lot from people who are closer to chief risk officers or enterprise risk management programs. They're the ones who are really talking about this because they know that risks evolve over time. Sometimes they are emergent, sometimes they're getting bigger, sometimes they recede. And if you don't have a feedback loop to give you more insight, then you're just going to keep on doing what you've been doing forever. And we all know the risk profile of a company does not stay the same forever. So it seems to be a very hot concept among corporate risk officer circles these days, and I wouldn't be surprised if we hear it chatted up more often among the chattering classes, like you and me.
It seems that these concepts are really being driven at right now, for the most part, in the financial industry or financial services industry. If that's correct, do you see that moving into other areas of risk or other areas of compliance?
I kind of think so. It may look and feel a little bit different or have slightly different drivers, but particularly in financial services, I think regulators are very clearly saying, compliance was what you did after Sarbanes-Oxley, but before we all missed the financial crisis. They no longer want boards to be thinking just in terms of, have we done all of our compliance? That's great. Everything's fine. Meeting adjourned. That's out. Uh, the financial regulators are really thinking in terms of systemic risk, and that is a very all-encompassing thing. And they're telling boards, this is really, your job is much more about risk management. It's more about governance. That compliance is a part of that, but it's much bigger. So that's where all of this is coming from. They're trying to seal up all possible ways we could have another disaster like what we saw in 2008. You will see that sort of mindset, I think, creep into non-financial companies eventually. A lot of the board directors at finance companies are CEOs somewhere else, and they are often CEOs at non-financial companies who will come back from their board meetings saying, this is great, I want this at my company. You can also see, particularly around cybersecurity, that it is another risk that's out there, regardless of how compliant you are. There are plenty of companies that are compliant with PCI data security standards. They still get hacked, and you still have a risk. You still have liability. It doesn't matter that you were compliant with everything. There's risk management that transcends your compliance obligations. And I could see a lot of retailers maybe drifting towards this because cybersecurity is such a pernicious risk for them. Probably will wind up with this becoming a much more mainstream idea, I think, in many different sectors. And it's not a bad idea to have out there.
I certainly agree with that. Well, Matt, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time once again. But could you tell the folks a little bit about your new or ongoing website, what you're doing with it, and where you might be headed?
Well, I am doing various research projects for a couple of clients, writing some white papers and things like that on various subjects, none of which have been published yet, although some will be published soon, generally around governance and compliance topics. My blog really is just, Matt's views on governance, risk, and compliance for the world, for anybody who may or may not care to read them. They are generally not reflective of anybody's opinion other than my own. And you can take them for all that they're worth, whether they're worth a lot or there's some cynics out there who might say they're not worth much. But Radical Compliance is just my own personal blog while I'm doing some research that I would love to take out to the community when it's ready.
Well, for my money, it's views that certainly people should consider, and you put out some great information, and I think you should continue to do so.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom.
Matt, till next time, thanks again.
Take care.